Good evening. As Daniel said, my name is Diane Hatz, and I am very excited to be moderating tonight's event. I hope you guys don't mind. I had foot surgery recently, so I'm going to stay seated as I introduce people. But before we start, I just want to remind all the speakers that you have 5 minutes, and there's a gong, and they're going to use it. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Jonathan Bloom. Jonathan has made the issue of food waste digestible, so to speak, with his book American Wasteland and his blog Wasted Food. They're must-reads for anybody interested in food waste. Jonathan?
Okay. Thanks so much for being here. When I meet people at a dinner party, they often ask me things like, since you've written this book about food waste, are you keeping an eye on what we eat and don't eat? And when I hear that, I like to put a reassuring arm around that person's shoulder and say, yes. And if it's a really good dinner party, I might say something like, are you going to finish that? All jokes aside, it's a good point to remember, let's try to practice what we preach, and let's do a good job of actually finishing the hors d'oeuvres out in the lobby, or maybe packing them up and taking them home. Okay, so I wanted to set the table, if you will, for tonight's event with 3 main points. My first thing I'd love for you to remember is that food waste is a problem that needs to be solved now because it has grave ethical, environmental, and economic consequences. So with the first one, from an ethical standpoint, to have a juxtaposition of hunger on the one hand with waste on the other hand, to me that is morally callous, and that's something we need to change. So to have 15% of Americans food insecure while we're squandering about 40% of our food, that's unconscionable, and that is something we need to change. From an environmental standpoint, when we squander as much food as we do, we are wasting the resources, the natural resources embedded in our food. And so in particular, thinking about energy and water. About 4% of all energy used in this country is embedded in the food that we don't use. And with water, it's about 25%. Now there's another issue at play environmentally, and that is when we throw away food and it goes to a landfill, it creates methane, a greenhouse gas that aids climate change. Now that one isn't quite as big of a deal because it's not like much food ends up in a landfill, right? Sorry, what's that? 97% of our food scraps end up in a landfill? Oh, well maybe we should pay attention to the methane question. Moving on to the economics. From a straight dollars and cents standpoint, it's not a great use of money. Globally, about $750 billion are invested in food that's not used. In the US, it's about $240 billion. And closer to home, every year we are throwing away about $2,000 worth of food through the food we waste. And that's an opportunity for budget improvements there. Moving along on that same note, in our own lives, when we think about, well, my next main point is that we all have a role to play in this issue. And certainly everyone throughout the food chain from farm to fork can make improvements, but we as individuals have a major opportunity here. We don't have great data on how much is wasted at each step of the food chain, but all indications point toward us, and us as the main source of food waste, or the largest source of waste. So for me, there's good and bad news there. The bad news is that we're pretty darn wasteful. The good news is that we can have a major impact on food waste. My third point and final one is that composting is a fabulous way to recycle the nutrients in food, but it should be paired with a concurrent food waste reduction program. And to be composting without thinking about reduction is kind of like a side dish without the entree. And there isn't as much attention on reduction because it asks us to change our behavior. And that's scary to some people. And some people believe that's a non-starter. But as you'll hear later tonight, there are plenty of people doing just that, reducing waste and making a major impact. So to conclude here, in about 15 or 20 years, we're going to look back on this period and be amazed and embarrassed at how much food we waste or wasted. And it's just a question of when that change is going to happen. So with all of your help, as people who are now food waste aware, let's make that change happen sooner rather than later. And now that you are so food waste aware, you're going to be looking for waste. You're going to see it everywhere because food waste is omnipresent. And the only word of warning I would give to you is
Jonathan got gonged.
they put me up to it. They told me I had to get gongs so that I would set a good tone. Anyway, now that you're food waste aware, just be careful because once you start to see food waste, you can't unsee it. Thank you very much.